Tonight's video is going to review the first 3 of the 6 traits of good writing: ideas, organization, and voice, because we really need to know what these are in order to be able to read our mentor text like a writer. All right, first of all, we're going to talk about what good writing is. And you can tell when something is well written just by reading it, because, and as I read in a lot of your reading ladders, a lot of you found the text hard when the reading wasn't very well done. And that if it was well written, it made the text easier to read. So it's easy to tell when you've read something that's well written, but it gets harder if you have to explain why it's well written. And the 6 traits give us language, or they give us signposts or ways to look at something and describe whether or not it's well written. So that's why we're looking at the 6 traits this time. All right, the first trait I want to begin with is the trait of ideas. There are 6 traits, and I'm reviewing these for you in their order of importance. The next video is going to look at the last 3. But the first trait we're going to look at is the trait of ideas. And ideas is really the most important piece of a part of writing. The ideas is kind of like the foundation. If you have ideas that are interesting and important, then it's going to be easier to make a better piece of writing. After all, ideas are the reason that a writer writes. So when we talk about having a main idea, and this is going to connect into the timeline that we got in class the other day, when you talk to me about, okay, the idea that I want to explore in my memoir, when you talk about a main idea is in a complete sentence. Just like a theme is always in a complete sentence, that's because a theme is a main idea. So the main idea isn't falling down the stairs. A main idea isn't breaking my leg. A main idea isn't getting lost at Dillard's. A main idea has to be a complete sentence. So when you're looking in your notebook, you're looking at your life topics, you'll know you found an important main idea when you can state it in a main idea. And on the flip side, when you're looking at someone else's writing, when you're looking at a mentor text, trying to get ideas, you should be able to put the author's main idea in a complete sentence. The other thing about a main idea is it has to be something that's important to the author. If it isn't important to the author, it certainly isn't going to be important to the reader. So as a writer who is reading other people's writing, you need to ask yourself, how do I know that this is important? How does the author let me know this is important? And finally, an important main idea has to feel important to the audience, and that's where the writer's skill comes in. So as we're examining our mentor texts, one of the things we're going to look at is, how do we know that this idea is important to the author, and how does the author write this so that it feels important to us as well? And this is kind of an important piece to remember. It is the foundation for everything else we're going to do. The trait of ideas also includes looking at details. Are the details that are included interesting, so that they help us understand the main idea? And details comes into play with understanding why something is important and making it feel important to us. Authors choose details very, very carefully. If you remember when we were talking about reading like a reader, when we were talking about reading for depth and complexity, we were looking for details and asking questions. Why are these details included? This is no different. But now, as a writer, we're looking at, how does the author choose the details, and how do the details help make the main idea interesting? How do the details help us understand why the main idea is important? Details are also showing details that help us make pictures in our mind as we read. You don't want to bore your reader. You want to make sure that they see exactly what they want, what you want them to see. So that if I use details like good and nice, good could mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Details are included in the piece of writing so that we see exactly what the writer wants us to see. So when we're looking at reading like a writer, we're not just looking at details that help us understand why things are important, but we're looking at details, we're thinking about the kinds of pictures they put into our mind, and we're asking ourselves, why these details, why these pictures? Another important piece of ideas is a purpose. It's very important that you know exactly why you're writing what you wrote. And it's the same thing when you read like a writer. What kinds of purposes does a writer write for? What does the writer want us to think, or what do they want us to do? And how do they help us see that through the details they include? Some other ways of thinking about reading like a writer. And finally, ideas also include something surprising or unusual. And this also connects back into voice. So as we're reading like writers, we're looking at what in this piece is unusual. What in this piece is something I wouldn't have thought of? Where are details or ideas or purposes that are unique, that help me think in a way that I wouldn't have thought of without this piece? All of these are pieces of ideas, and reading like a writer, we're looking at these kinds of things. The second trait is logical and effective organization. Once I have really great ideas, the next step is to organize them in a way that makes things easier for the reader. And interestingly, in your reading letters, one of the things that every single one of you that wrote about difficult texts talked about was, I couldn't predict what was coming next. I couldn't figure out how this piece fit into that piece. All of that looks at organization. Ideas don't make much sense if they aren't arranged in some way that the writer or the reader can tell the arrangement is there. Something has to come first, something has to go last, and several things have to end up in the middle, one after another in a logical sequence. So the trait of ideas looks at, is it a really good opening? How does the author hook me into the idea? It looks at, how clearly does one idea lead to the next? Does the writer lead me through his piece of writing by the hand? Can I understand why paragraph 1 is first and how paragraph 2 supports paragraph 1? I look at the ending and I ask myself, does he leave me something to think about? Does he leave me satisfied? So organization includes a beginning that catches your attention and makes you want to read more. When you're looking at your memoir texts, reading like a writer, we're going to look at what kinds of leads, what kinds of hooks do the authors of our mentor texts use? Do they catch your attention? Do they make me want to read more? How did they do that? We also look at an ending. Well, how do authors end their pieces? Does the ending feel finished to us? Does the ending leave us with something to think about? How did the author accomplish that? We look at how the author arranged their ideas. How did they decide? I wonder how they decided what came first and what came next. Did the author spend the right amount of time on each part? If we want a reader to slow down, we put lots of details there. If we want a reader to speed up, we don't give them as much detail. We want the reader to slow down on what's important. We want them to speed by on what we need to include just to connect things. That's something we need to look at as readers that read like writers. And finally, is the writing easy to follow? Or do I have to really struggle to make the connection? Do I have to stop and reread and wonder why this came next and this came next? Good writing is easy to follow from part to part. So when we read other people's writing to learn how to do it, we look at beginnings, we look at endings, we look for transitions, we look for ways that the author signals connections to us. The third trait I'm going to talk about tonight is voice. Voice is all about choice. And I want a metaphor for thinking about this is thinking about personal style. When you think about someone and you describe their personal style, you think about the kinds of clothing they wear. You think about how they wear their hair. You think about the kinds of music, maybe, that they listen to, or the kinds of things that they like to do. So that I think everybody would agree that our personal style is very clearly communicated to other people by the choices we make and how we act, how we dress, how we carry ourselves, the kinds of people we hang with. Writing is absolutely the same way. The voice in writing is all about your choice. The key to good writing is that your writing is different from everybody else's. When we write about big topics like love or hate or jealousy, there really isn't anything new we have to offer. People like Shakespeare and Einstein and Christ in the Bible have all talked about these big things. And we really can't offer much beyond that. But when we write specific, when we write about topics that matter to us, when we choose to write about the world the way it looks and feels to us, when we're careful about the words we use, when we're careful about the details we choose, when we look at our beginnings and we look at our endings and all those different kinds of things, we begin to establish a voice. And if this still isn't clear to you, think about Edgar Allan Poe. He is the easiest person to talk about voice of anyone I know. When I mention Edgar Allan Poe to you, you think about dark, depressed, the Raven, death. You think about long, long sentences. All of those things are choices that Poe has made again and again and again. And each of those choices has established his voice. You would be able to pick Edgar Allan Poe's writing out from, say, John Green or Dr. Seuss because of voice. When you read a mentor text as a writer, you look at how things fit together. You look at patterns. You look at the topics they picked. You look at the word choice they made. You look at the details they've included. You look at how they begin and how they end. And you put it together and you look and see what kind of patterns are reoccurring. And this is where voice comes from. Voice is tone or mood, and it tells the reader what the writer's personality is. Because each of us has a very unique personality. Each of us has a unique voice in writing, and that's what makes our writing unique. You can have excellent organization, you can have excellent ideas, but if there's no voice, the writing is still going to fall flat. The reason that people write is to communicate what's important to us. We all want to be understood, and that communication, that message, comes across in your voice. Voice means that the reader can tell you care about the topic. The first choice every writer has to make is what they're going to write about. In order to write well, you have to care about your topic. If you're not interested, your audience won't be interested either. So when we read as writers, we look at the mentor texts and we look for the ways that the writer shows us they really, really care about their topic. So when we sit down with ICE, or when we sit down with Everything Will Be Okay, or when we sit down with some of the other mentor texts I'm going to give you, we're looking for places where we can tell they care and how they communicate that caring. We also look for places where there's strong feelings or honest statements. We know our personalities have to do with what we feel. If everybody felt the same way about everything, we'd all do, say, and think the same things. We'd all be the same and life would be pretty boring. And one of us would be just as good as the next of us. I, as your teacher, cannot imagine having to choose who I would keep in my classroom and who I would choose not to have, because each and every one of you is very different in important ways, and those differences bring important aspects of the world into our classroom. Writing is no different. It's important that your feelings about things are very clearly communicated in our writing. So when you read as writers, you look for places where the author's feelings come across. You look for places where you feel like the author is making very honest statements. And that's where you're going to find voice. So as readers, as writers who are reading to learn from other writers, we're going to look at how can we tell the writer cares about the topic. Where are their strong feelings? Where are their honest statements? And what does this tell us about the writer? Because when we look at how other people do it, it helps us do it in our own writing. So voice includes your individuality coming through. I don't expect you to all sound like everyone else. Voice includes the places where it sounds real, where it was written by a real person, And if you want to compare and contrast here, think about the writing I expect you to do in my classroom and compare it to the writing that was on your benchmark. Voice includes originality. This is something I wouldn't have thought of if I hadn't read it from someone else. Voice includes a personality behind the words. Voice includes tone that is appropriate for the audience and appropriate for the purpose. And we're going to talk more about purpose in a focus lesson. But voice is critical. The writing should breathe because you put yourself into it. Because we're writers ourselves, we're going to begin to read like a writer by paying close attention to how other writers put organization, ideas, and voice together to make meaning in the piece and to make it better writing. And we're doing this so that we can borrow what we learn from other writers by reading like writers. And I've talked about ideas, organization, and voice. And the purpose of this last slide is just to summarize for you. Remember that it's the heart of the piece. It's about why the writer is writing and the information they choose to reveal. So what we're looking for is, how does the writer show us main idea? What kinds of details does the writer use? How does the writer achieve his purpose? How do they communicate his purpose to us? How does the writer's choice of ideas impact us? We're looking at organization. How does the writer get us into it? What kind of lead? How does the lead pull us in? How does it make us want to write more? What kind of endings did the writer use? How do they work to make the writing feel finished? We look at voice. How does the writer demonstrate passion? How do they reveal emotion? This is a critical page or a critical piece of this video. When we come together and discuss on Tuesday or Wednesday, we're going to look at the questions that are on this slide. So I will have expected you to prepare for class discussion by taking the questions from ideas, the questions from organization, and the questions from voice, and thinking about ICE, thinking about everything will be okay, thinking about the piece I gave you from the paper, and being prepared to talk about these kinds of questions about ideas organization when we discuss reading like a writer in our next class. The same WSQ reminder: be an active viewer. Pause it, review it more than once, stop it, rewind it. Watch it once through and then watch it through a second time to take notes. I expect you to take good notes. Please, no copying from slide to slide. I've added so much more with just my narration over the notes on the slides that if all you copy are the slides, you don't have enough. Write an effective summary. Remember that the purpose of the summary is to check your understanding. What's the overall point I'm trying to make in this video? Can you say it in 30 words or less? And finally, write a good question to help check your own understanding, and perhaps to pose a question you still don't understand to share with your peers. And finally, last but not least, I have a song from Adele tonight, and we're going to dance.